Maeve Sullivan was 27 years old the morning she found the bag. She wasn't looking for it. She wasn't looking for anything except a clam bed that turned out not to exist, following a rumor passed around the Stonehaven docks, a rumor one man had heard from somebody else, and repeated with the confidence of a person who'd never verified a single thing in his life. The rocks had been empty for 2 hours. She had a few coins in her pocket. She hadn't eaten since the night before. The storm had blown itself out overnight, leaving a sky the color of tin and a small boat broken in two out on the shoals, its ribs jutting up like the bones of something dead. Her hands were rough from wind and rope, her dark brown hair stiff with salt, her gray eyes the color of rough water moving across the rocks out of a habit older than hope. Then she saw it, not clams. A black waterproof bag wedged in a crevice, split along one seam. She saw what was inside before she understood what she was seeing: money, vacuum-sealed bricks of it, thick enough to rewrite the arithmetic of an entire life in a single morning. She stood very still. Maeve knew that in 18 months of widowhood and want, she'd never taken so much as a dime that wasn't hers, and she knew this money was nothing like anything honest that had ever washed up on the Maine coast. She looked up the beach. Empty. She looked out to sea. Empty. She looked at the bag, then at her own worn boots. Then she heard it, a sound from behind a granite outcrop maybe 30 feet off. Not a gull, not the water working at the stone, but a human sound, broken, straining, the sound of someone trying not to die. She should have run. A wiser woman would have taken the bag and vanished before the next wave came in. But Maeve Sullivan wasn't built that way, and everything that came after that morning, the man she found bleeding out in the rocks, the dark world he carried with him, and the buried truth about her husband's death she was about to dig up, all of it came down to that sound and what she chose to do when she heard it. If this story moves you, tap that like button so it can reach more people. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And don't forget to subscribe, because there's a new story waiting for you every week. Maeve moved around the rain-soaked granite outcrop, each step careful on the slick layer of seaweed, and then she saw him. A man lying on his back between two slabs of stone, one side of his body pressed down into the damp sand as though the sheer weight of him were trying to hold something inside from spilling out. His suit had once been expensive, the kind of fabric Maeve had never touched in her life. But now it was torn open at the ribs, darkened by a stain she did not need to look closely at to know what it was. A bullet had grazed his side, not buried deep, but it had not spared him either. His face had gone pale beneath his tanned skin, and a thin scar ran along his left jawbone, as if someone had once tried to erase him from this world and failed. His hair was black, silvering early at the temples, and his eyes, that was what made Maeve stop short. His eyes were still open, still cold, still studying her from below, with the alertness of a man who had never allowed himself to lose control, even while lying half dead on a desolate shore of stone. He did not look at her the way a dying man looked at someone who had come to save him. He looked at her as though he were calculating how much she was worth and how much trouble she could cause. "The money bag," he said. His voice was hoarse, broken by blood loss, but it was not a plea. It was an order, the kind of order that came from a man used to being obeyed, a man who had never had to say anything twice in his life. "Put it down where you're standing and come here." Maeve did not come closer. She stood still, the waterproof bag still heavy in her hand, and looked at him with an unblinking gaze that had seen too many things wash up on this coast to be easily frightened by a voice. She had pulled stranded whales from the tide, had dragged shattered boats off the rocks in storms, had once sat beside the bed of a man she loved after they brought him back from the sea, and known there was nothing left to do. Blood did not panic her, and a man giving orders when he could not even sit up certainly did not. "You're bleeding," she said, her voice flat as still water at slack tide. "You can argue with me later." Something passed through his eyes, not quite surprise, but a recalculation, like a chess player realizing the piece across from him was not moving the way he had expected. He tried to lift himself and immediately paid for it, a sound escaping through clenched teeth, and his hand searched down at his side for something that was no longer there. Maeve understood the gesture. He was looking for a weapon, or for a phone, and both were gone. She glanced toward the gray water gnawing at the shallows, where last night's waves had swallowed everything that had not been tied down, and she guessed correctly. Whatever had once helped him call his people was lying somewhere on the cold bottom out there, along with most of the boat that had brought him here. His men, whoever they were, wherever they were as far from him now as the moon. He was alone on her shore of stone, and he knew it, and the fact that he knew it made his jaw tighten harder than the pain itself. "Who are you?" he asked, softer this time, not out of courtesy, but because his voice was running out. "Someone who happened to pass by," Maeve answered. "You're not someone who happened to be here." She set the bag down on a flat slab of rock, not giving it to him, only no longer wanting to hold it, and he followed the movement with such sharp attention that she could almost feel it touch her skin. "You could leave," he said. "Take the bag and leave. No one would know. I would know," she said. And she realized, the moment those two words left her mouth, that this was the whole problem, that for the past 18 months, the fact that she always knew, always had to live with what she knew, was the thing that had kept her on the right side of every line, even when crossing over would have been so much easier. She did not understand who this man was. She did not know where the bullet wound had come from, did not know who the money in the bag belonged to, did not know what world had thrown him onto her shore, along with a broken boat and a bullet still warm from the gun. But she knew the sound she had heard behind the rocks was the sound of a human being trying not to die, and she knew she was not the kind of person who turned her back on that sound. She unwound the old scarf from her neck, knelt beside him, and began doing the thing that some still clear part of her knew she might one day regret. The scarf pressed hard against the wound, Maeve's two hands holding steady pressure, while her mind moved far faster than her fingers. One part of her, the cold and practical part sharpened by 18 months of hunger and hardship, was telling her very clearly that she still had a choice. She could stand up right now, take the bag from that flat slab of rock, and walk toward town before the sun rose too high. This man would not be able to chase her, not with a hole like that in his side. The money in the bag was enough to wipe away the debt that was eating her alive. Enough to buy back the boatyard, enough to make sure Rosa would never again have to go to sleep with her stomach growling. She thought of all those things clearly, without flinching from them, because she was not the kind of person who lied to herself and pretended such thoughts had never appeared. They had appeared, and then she thought of the past 18 months. She thought of the day they brought Daniel back from the sea, and she stood in the yard watching them carry him across the threshold, thought of the months after, that when the creditors tightened their grip and took the boatyard from her piece by piece, thought of the winter when she mended nets for hire, until her fingers cracked and bled just to buy enough heating oil for a child who was not her own by blood. In all those months, there had been countless moments when taking something that did not belong to her would have been easy. The ownerless lobster basket drifting into the dock, the loose change someone had forgotten on the fish counter, the good net caught on the rocks after its owner had given up. She had never touched a single one of those things. Not because she was afraid of being caught, but because she knew that once she pulled one thread loose from herself, the whole net would begin to unravel, and she had seen too many people out there torn apart by exactly that. Daniel used to tell her that a minor leak could eventually sink the strongest vessel. He had been talking about boats and fishing, but she had always understood that he meant something larger than that. So when the decision came, it did not come like a flash of lightning. It had been there for a long time already, woven into her through every month she had chosen hunger instead of taking. She was not saving this man because he deserved to be saved. She did not even know who he was. She was saving him because she was not the kind of person who could hear a human being, trying not to die and then turn her back and walk away. When that became clear in her mind, as clear as the ebbing tide leaving flat sand behind, she let out a breath and faced the next question, the much harder one. She could not take him to the hospital. A bullet wound meant police, and the police in Stonehaven were the last thing Maeve wanted to be tangled up with. She remembered far too clearly how they had handled Daniel's death, remembered the young officer rushing to close the file within only a few days, calling it an accident at sea even though Daniel was the best seaman in the area, and the water that night had been silent as glass. She remembered the way they avoided her eyes when she asked why a man who knew the water so well would drown in a stretch he had crossed 1,000 times. She remembered the name Cormac Healy flickering at the edges of every story she could never prove. Remembered the feeling that there were threads running from that small police station to places she should not look into. Since that day, Maeve had no longer believed that calling the police meant calling for help. To her, calling them only meant opening a door, when she could never control what stepped out from behind it. The man lying under her hands moved slightly, and when she looked down, his eyes were watching her again, still sharp, keenly perceptive, as though he could read every calculation that had just passed through her mind. "You're not calling anyone," he said, not as a question. "No," she replied. "Good," he said, and for one brief moment, the coldness in him softened enough for her to see the exhaustion beneath it. The exhaustion of someone who had gone far too long, without being allowed to trust anyone. Maeve tightened the knot in the scarf, slipped one hand beneath his shoulder, and spoke in the voice of someone who had made up her mind and had nothing left to discuss. "I know a place. Can you stand, or do I have to drag you like a broken boat?" Moving him took more effort than she had expected. The man managed to stand, but every step put his weight on Maeve's shoulder, and by the time they made it off the rocks, her arm had gone numb from keeping him from falling. The old boat-building shed stood about half a mile from the shore. On a stretch of coast no one visited anymore, a silver-gray wooden structure from a time when Stone Haven still built boats by hand before the big yards outside the city swallowed the whole trade. Daniel had once meant to repair it, had talked about the day they would turn it into their own workshop, and that day had never come. Now the roof leaked, the windows were fogged with salt dust, and the smell of old pine resin still clung to every grain of wood, like a promise that had not been kept in time. Maeve lowered him onto the tarp she had quickly spread across the floor, and for the first time since finding him, she allowed herself to breathe. He leaned back against the wall, pale, but his eyes never left her. "Who are you going to call?" he asked, and the question carried a wariness that made her understand that to this man, every new name was a possible threat. "Someone I trust," Maeve replied. "That's all you need to know." Niamish Foley arrived within half an hour, carrying her leather veterinary bag, and an expression that showed she had already guessed. She was about to step into something terrible. The two of them had known each other since they were barefoot girls, running along the fish docks, and Niam was the only person in this town Maeve could call at dawn with the words, "I need you, don't ask anything," and know she would come. Niam knelt beside the man, cut through the fabric of the shirt that had stuck to his skin, and worked in silence with hands used to dealing with bodies that could not say where they hurt. A long while later, she finally sat up straight. "He's lucky," Niam said quietly, low enough that only Maeve could hear. The bullet only grazed him. It cut a long line, but it didn't lodge inside. It didn't touch any organs, didn't touch anything that would kill him within a few hours. He's lost a lot of blood and he'll be weak for a while. But if the wound stays clean and he doesn't move too much, he'll live. She stitched the wound closed with neat little sutures, bandaged it tightly, then washed her hands in the basin of water. Maeve had drawn from the outside tap, and when she turned back to look at her friend, her expression had changed. "Maeve," she said, "I'm not asking who he is because I don't want to know, but I know what a bullet wound looks like, and I know people don't get shot for small reasons. That suit, the way he looks at everything in the room all at once, this man isn't a lost fisherman. You're keeping something deadly in this shed, and whoever shot him won't stop at one try." Maeve looked at the man leaning against the wall with his eyes closed, his face in that weakened sleep looking younger, almost more human, and she thought of the phone and the gun now lying at the bottom of the cold sea, thought of how he had asked who she would call in the voice of a man who had no one left to call. "He can't call anyone," she said, almost to herself. "His people, if he has any, don't know where he is either. He washed up here alone." Niama looked at her for a long time. "Whether that makes him safer for you or more dangerous, I'm not sure," she said. "A man who can't call anyone is a man no one can save. But he's also a man no one can trace, at least not yet." Then Niam's gaze softened, and she asked the question Maeve had been waiting for. "What about Rosa?" Maeve tightened both hands. "She can't be near this place, not now. Will you keep her for me? Just for a few days?" Maeve said. "I'll tell her aunt is busy with boat work, that there's an urgent repair contract, and I have to stay on it for several days. She'll believe it. She always likes staying at your house, likes your old dog. I just need to know she's somewhere warm, watched over, and far away from anything that might follow this man here." Niam nodded and asked nothing more, because she understood that among everything Maeve was carrying, this was the one thing she absolutely would not allow herself to get wrong. "I'll pick her up this afternoon," Niam said, You take care of the rest." And when she reached the shed door, she stopped, turned her head, and added one sentence as softly as the sea wind. "Be careful, Maeve. What the tide brings in isn't always meant to be saved. Sometimes it only borrows you for a while." The first night passed with the wind slipping through the gaps in the boards, and the tide rising steadily outside, and by the next morning the man was fully awake, strong enough to sit with his back against the wall and watch Maeve warm a thin pot of fish soup on the old kerosene stove. He watched her work with the attention she was now beginning to recognize, an attention that never switched off, as though he were storing every movement she made somewhere inside himself to use later. She poured soup into a chipped bowl and handed it to him. He took it but did not drink right away, only held it between both hands as if to warm himself, and looked at her with eyes that had grown a little less cold after a night of surviving. "You didn't take the bag," he said. "You had a whole night. I was asleep. I wouldn't have known. You could gone." Maeve sat down on the wooden chair across from him, both hands wrapped around her own bowl of soup, and she thought for a while before answering, because she was the kind of person who did not say things before she had seen that they were true. "I used to have something," she said. "Something of my own. And I lost it, not because someone stole it from me, but because I made one very small mistake, and that small mistake dragged everything else after it. After that, I learned that when you start taking what doesn't belong to you, even when no one is watching, you're pulling a thread out of yourself. And I've seen enough people pull themselves apart until there was nothing left to hold them together." The man said nothing, only waited, and his silence was the kind of silence that knew how to invite someone to keep speaking. "My husband's name was Daniel," she said, and for the first time since he died, that name left her mouth without catching. "We had a small yard, building and repairing boats. It wasn't big, it wasn't rich, but it was ours, built from nothing with our own hands across 7 years. Daniel was the best man I ever knew at reading a boat. He only had to put his hand on the hull, and he would know where it was about to fail. He always used to say that in the sea trade, there are no small mistakes. Everything is tied together. One weak place will pull everything down if you don't mend it in time." She stopped, looking down at the soup cooling slowly in her hands. "And then we made the very mistake he was always warning about. A man hired us to build a large batch of boats, bigger than any order we'd ever taken. He promised us all kinds of things, shook our hands, looked us in the eyes, and gave his word. Daniel wanted a proper contract, black ink on white paper, but I was the one who said there was no need, that the man had already promised, that making a contract with a decent person was no different from telling him to his face that we didn't trust him. I trusted someone. That was the knot I let fail. We put in all our savings, borrowed more to buy timber and hire workers, finished the whole batch of boats, and that man disappeared. Not a cent." Maeve looked up, and there were no tears in her eyes, only the frightening calm of someone who had cried herself dry long ago. "We couldn't keep up with the debt. The creditors took the yard. And while we were sinking, Daniel took any extra job someone would pay him for, went out to sea in conditions he never would have accepted if we'd still had a choice. One night he went out and didn't come back. They said it was an accident." She said the last sentence in a voice so even that the evenness itself said everything, and the man noticed it. She saw him notice it, saw the way his gaze narrowed slightly, like someone who had just heard a wrong note in a familiar piece of music. But she did not say more about Daniel, because some wounds could not be opened in front of a stranger, and because she still did not know who this stranger was. "So now I mend nets for hire," she finished, setting the bowl down. "I dig clams. I live on spare change, and I don't take what doesn't belong to me, not because I'm noble, but because I've seen what happens when people begin. That's why your bag is still sitting exactly on the stone where I put it down." She stood and carried the 2 bowls away to wash them, and behind her, the man was silent for a very long time, so long she thought he had fallen asleep, until his voice came quietly and slowly, carrying something she could not name. "The man who ordered those boats," he said. "Do you remember his name?" Maeve let that question hang between them, her 2 hands going still over the bowl she had been washing, and she did not turn around right away. There was something in the way he asked, a concern too sharp for a man who had only just heard the sad story of a stranger, that sent a nameless unease prickling down her spine. "Why do you want to know?" she asked, still looking into the basin of water. The man did not answer directly. Instead, he spoke slowly, like someone deciding to reveal just enough and no more. Because I've spent my whole life among people who make promises and then disappear, he said. And I've learned that they never really disappear. They only move on to another name, another town, and do the same thing again to someone else. The man who took from you and Daniel didn't vanish into thin air. He's still somewhere, doing the same thing to someone else right now. Maeve turned back to look at him. You speak as though you know people like that. I do, he replied, not avoiding her eyes. I know them very well. There was an admission in that sentence that he did not try to hide, nor did he display it openly. He simply placed it between them like setting a knife on the table. The blade pointed at no one, yet everyone could see it was still a knife. Maeve wiped her hands on the front of her shirt and sat down again, this time more slowly, more carefully, like someone who had just realized she was sitting closer to the edge of something deeper than she had thought. Who are you? She asked. It was the question she had been trying not to ask ever since the rocks. The man looked at her for a long time, and she saw him weighing his answer, not whether he should lie, but how much truth he should tell. My name is Elias, he said. The rest of the answer won't make you feel safer, so I'll put it this way. I run things. Some of them are legitimate businesses, licensed, with accountants and names on the doors, and some are not. In the world I live in, people don't get shot by mistake. People get shot because someone has decided they're no longer useful, or they've become dangerous. I fell into the second case. Maeve said nothing, and Elias seemed almost struck by that very silence, because he looked at her with something like curiosity. You're not afraid, he said. I just told you I'm the kind of man decent people should stay away from, and you haven't moved back. Why? Maeve thought about the question honestly. Because I'm too tired to be afraid of anything else, she said. I've been afraid of hunger, afraid of winter, afraid of the day the creditors knock on my door for the last time, afraid of a child looking at me when I have nothing to give her. Compared with those fears, a wounded man lying in my shed isn't enough to make me tremble. Then she added, more softly, and you need me more than I need you, Elias. A person in that position usually isn't the most frightening one in the room. Something changed on his face when she said that, a small shift she almost missed, and it took her a moment to understand what she had just seen. He was not used to this. A man like Elias, who had spent his whole life among people who either shrank before him out of fear or huffed blood around him because they wanted something from him, was sitting for the first time across from someone who was not afraid of him and did not need anything from him, and he had no ready place in his mind to put her. At that moment, Maeve realized something else, something that made her heart turn cold. She thought back over everything he had just said, about being judged dangerous, about the broken boat out on the shallows, about a bullet that had not missed by accident. You weren't shot and then washed up here by chance, she said slowly, fitting each piece together as she spoke. Someone tried to kill you. And if they haven't found your body, if they aren't sure you're dead, then they're still looking. Elias did not deny it. He only looked at her with eyes that had returned to their familiar coldness. But this time Maeve understood that the coldness was not indifference. It was the way a person wrapped himself back up when he knew the storm had not yet passed. Yes, he said. They're still looking. And your town is very small, Maeve. Elias's words clung to Maeve all afternoon like an undertow, and to keep her hands busy, she gathered his torn clothes and took them out to wash in the wooden basin on the porch of the shed. The expensive suit was now little more than ruined fabric, but she still handled it carefully, partly out of the habit of someone who never wasted anything, partly because working with her hands was the only way she knew to quiet the thoughts rising inside her. She turned each pocket inside out before dipping it into the water, by the reflex of someone who had found fishing hooks or shards of glass in sailors' clothes too many times, and in a small pocket sewn shut inside the lining, her finger touched something hard. She hooked it out. A coin, but not money. It was heavier than money, made of some dark metal, one side engraved with something she had to tilt toward the light to see clearly, a seabird with wings spread over an anchor, bordered by letters she could not read. Maeve stood there, the cold coin lying in her wet palm, and the whole world around her seemed to go still, because she had seen this object before, not something like it, this very thing, or something identical to it, down to every carved line. The memory did not come back like lightning, but like water seeping through gaps in the boards, slow and impossible to stop. One evening, a few weeks before Daniel died, He had come home late, silent in a way that was not like him, and when she asked what was wrong, he only shook his head and said it was nothing. But that night she had seen him sitting for a long time at the kitchen table, turning a small object between two fingers, and, when she stepped closer, he closed his fist to hide it. But not quickly enough. She had seen it. A dark metal coin, a bird over an anchor. At the time she had thought nothing of it, assuming it was some old thing someone had paid him with in place of cash. One worthless object among the 1,000 worthless objects that passed through the hands of a man who worked the sea. She had forgotten it, until this moment, when it lay in her hand for the second time, this time taken from the jacket of a wounded man she had just saved from death. Maeve did not realize she had stopped breathing until her chest began to ache for air. She leaned against the wall of the shed, the coin clenched so tightly in her fist that its edge pressed into her skin, and let the thought she had been trying to push away since that afternoon finally rush in. Daniel had held this object. Daniel, who had never been involved in anything shadowed, who had only wanted to build boats and pay off debts and live in peace, had held in his hand the very same mark carried by the man inside her shed, and a few weeks later, he went out to sea on a windless night and never came back. People called it an accident. She had never believed it. And now, for the first time in 18 months, that disbelief had a shape, a seabird over an anchor, something tying her Daniel to the world the man had just admitted he belonged to. Maeve looked through the crack in the door into the shed, where Elias was leaning against the wall in sleep, his face softened by exhaustion, and a chill ran through her that had nothing to do with the sea wind. She had pulled this man back from death. She had pressed her hand to his wound, had spread a tarp for him to lie on, had poured soup into a bowl for him, had sent Rosa away to keep him safe. And perhaps, very perhaps, he was a thread leading straight into the bad knot that had torn the entire net of her life apart. Perhaps she had just saved the very world that had killed her husband. She did not know. That was the most terrible thing. She did not know. And she could not simply walk in and ask him directly. Because if he truly was what she feared, then letting him know she had pieced things together might be the most dangerous thing she had ever done. Maeve opened her hand and looked at the coin one more time, the seabird with wings spread over the anchor, cold and silent, holding tight to its secret. Then she slipped it into her own pocket, as deep as it would go, and walked back into the shed with the face she had spent her whole life training not to reveal anything, carrying with her a question that had now taken an entirely different shape. Not how dangerous are you, but where were you on the night my Daniel went to sea? The next morning, Maeve went into town to buy bandages and food, wearing the calm mask she had sharpened through a night with almost no sleep, and the town greeted her with something she recognized at once as wrong. There was a strange car parked near the fish dock, black, clean, the kind of car that did not belong in a place where every vehicle was coated in salt and rust. And leaning against the fish counter, speaking to the old fishmonger in a voice too familiar for someone asking questions instead of making inquiries, was Cormac Healy. Maeve stopped short. Cormac was the creditor who had taken her boatyard from her, the name she could never prove but had always felt circling the edges of Daniel's death, and his presence at the fish dock on a morning like this was not an accident. He saw her before she could step back. Maeve Sullivan. He called, pulling away from the fish counter and walking toward her with a smile that never reached his eyes. Long time no see. I hear you still owe me a little something, and interest doesn't have my patience. Maeve kept her voice even. I'm still paying, bit by bit. He nodded slowly, but his eyes were not on her. They moved around the dock, sweeping over the boats, the faces, like a man looking for something other than the money she owed. Small towns are terrible at keeping secrets, he said, his voice light as though he were talking about the weather. That storm the other night washed all kinds of things ashore. Someone said they saw pieces of a strange boat out on the shallows. You work the water, Maeve. Did you happen to pick up anything interesting? She felt the coin in her coat pocket suddenly grow heavier, and she felt the money bag hidden in the shed half a mile away, as though it were glowing through every wall. I dig clams, she replied. The storm only brought me seaweed and stones. Cormac looked at her for one beat longer than was natural, then smiled and stepped back, but before he turned away, he said something that sent cold down her spine. If you do happen to see something that doesn't belong to you, he said, the wisest thing would be to hand it back to the right people. Some things that wash ashore are much more dangerous to keep than your debt. He climbed into the black car and drove away. But Maeve knew he would come back, and this time his presence around town was no longer about collecting a debt. He was hunting. She went straight to the church, her heart burning with one urgent need, to see with her own eyes that Rosa was safe. She found the girl in the small room behind the church, where Father Brennan was teaching the neighborhood children to sing. And when Rosa saw her, she ran over and threw herself around Maeve's legs, chattering about the new song she had learned, about Aunt Niam's old dog, about how Father Brennan had promised them all cake if they sang the whole song. Maeve knelt and held the girl close, kissing her hair, and for one moment the whole world of coins and black cars and wounded men drew back, leaving only the warm weight of a child who believed she was safe because Maeve was there. "You be good here with Father and Aunt Niam," she said. "Your aunt still has boat work to finish, just a few more days." Rosa nodded, long used to the days when her aunt was busy, and ran back to the children calling for her. Father Brennan walked Maeve to the door, and once they were out of the children's hearing, he looked at her with old eyes that had spent 50 years reading people. "Something is wrong, child," he said. "Don't deny it. I saw it on your face the moment you walked in." Maeve did not tell him everything, could not tell him everything, but she asked a question she had not meant to ask, and it simply broke free. "Do you remember how they closed Daniel's file, Father? Did it ever seem too quick to you?" Father Brennan's face grew grave. "I remember," he said softly, "and I wasn't the only one who thought it was wrong. There's a man I've known for a long time, an investigator outside the county now, one of the rare honest ones. Back then, he told me Daniel's death smelled wrong, that if someone could give him a thread to pull, he would pull it. But at the time we had nothing except instinct." He studied her more closely. "You're holding some kind of thread now, aren't you, Maeve?" She did not answer. She only tightened her hand around the coat pocket where the coin lay, thanked Father, and stepped out beneath the tin-colored sky, carrying the fear that Cormac would find the shed before she understood what she was holding. Maeve returned to the shed, with a plan already taking shape in her mind the entire way back. Because she knew Cormac would come, and she knew that when he came, plain lies would not be enough. A man like him did not believe words. He believed traces. So before the sun went down, she did the work of someone who had spent her whole life reading the sea and the things the sea left behind. She took the torn piece of Elias's suit, the expensive fabric impossible to mistake for anything else, soaked it in the dried blood still clinging to the old tarp, then carried it out to the shallows as the tide was going out. She dragged a heavy sandbag from the shed down to the water's edge, leaving across the damp sand a long trail, like the mark of a body being pulled, then wedged the piece of suit into a crack in the rock, right where the waves struck, hidden enough to look as though it had been caught there by chance, visible enough for a man searching to find. She did all of it with steady hands, and Elias, awake enough now to understand what she was doing, quietly withdrew into the darkest corner of the shed behind the stack of old planks, where someone who did not know to look would never glance. "He'll check," he said softly. "I know," she replied. "Then let him find exactly what I want him to find." Cormac came when the sky had already darkened, without knocking, only shoving the shed door open, and stepping inside with a gun already in his hand and 2 men standing behind him. He was no longer pretending to be friendly. "I know he washed up here," Cormac said, his eyes sweeping through the shed. "A man, wounded, carrying something that belongs to me." "Where are you hiding him, Maeve?" She stood in the middle of the shed, her hand hanging at her sides, and let the real fear inside her show just enough, because a completely calm person would have been suspicious. "I found a man," she said, her voice trembling just the right amount. "The morning after the storm, on the rocks. He was still breathing, but only barely. I didn't know who he was. I was scared. I tried to drag him up, but he was too heavy and the wound was—" She let the sentence break off. "He died in my hands, Cormac, right by the water's edge, and then the tide came in. I couldn't hold him. The waves took him." Cormac stared at her, the gun still not lowered. He signaled to one of his men, and the man circled the shed, flipping over each tarp, while Maeve kept her breathing, even though her heart was pounding as if it might burst, because that man was moving close to the stack of planks where Elias was hiding. She spoke at exactly the right moment, pulling the attention back to herself. "If you don't believe me, go look at the shallows," she said, almost shouting. "There's still a mark where I tried to drag him, and his jacket cloth is caught on the rocks. I didn't dare touch it. Cormac stopped. He jerked his head, and all three men went out to the shallows beneath the dim moonlight, Maeve going with them, because she knew that if she let them search on their own, her arrangement would appear too neat. They saw the long drag mark in the sand. They saw the piece of expensive suit wedged in the crack of the rock, dark with blood, impossible to deny. Cormac picked up the fabric, turned it in his hand beneath the moon. And Maeve saw the suspicion on his face slowly give way to something else, the confidence of a man who had just seen exactly what he had come to find. When the sea takes back what it gives, it keeps it, she said quietly, in the voice of someone who had buried too many people. He's out there now. One of the two men muttered that finding a body in these waters would be hopeless, that the current would already have carried it far out. Cormac stood still for a very long time, the piece of suit in his hand. Then he turned toward Maeve, and for one moment she thought she had lost, thought he had seen through everything. But he only shoved the fabric into his pocket and said, "If you're lying to me, Maeve, that debt of yours will be the kindest thing you'll ever have to worry about." Then he left, the black car swallowed by the darkness, and Maeve stood on the shallows until the sound of the engine had completely faded, her knees shaking as fear was finally allowed to flood through her. She had done it, and part of why she had done it, she knew, was because through the entire performance, one thought had anchored her firmly, that Rosa was at the church, warm and safe, singing a song about cake, far from this place and far from everything that had just happened. When she went back into the shed, Elias stepped out of the darkness behind the stack of planks, his face pale but his eyes looking at her in an entirely new way, and for a very long time he could not say a word. Elias stood leaning against the stack of planks, his breathing still shallow from holding it for so long moments ago, and when he finally spoke, his voice was entirely different, stripped of its familiar layer of command. "You could handed me over," he said. "He offered you a way out and a reward besides. I was lying behind that pile of boards, unarmed, unable to stand without holding on to the wall. All you needed was one word, one tilt of your head, and every burden you carry would have disappeared tonight." Maeve sat down on the wooden chair, her hand still trembling faintly, and she did not answer at once, because she was the kind of person who let the truth settle before she scooped it up. "I know," she said at last. "I thought about it. I won't lie to you and say I didn't. In the moment he pointed that gun at me, one part of my mind calculated very quickly that all I had to do was point toward you and it would be over. I would be free." She lifted her eyes to him. "But calculating and choosing are two different things. I calculated. Then I chose. And I didn't choose because of you, Elias. I still don't know who you are. I chose because I know who I am, and I'm not someone who sells a life lying in my hands just to buy relief for myself." Elias looked at her for a long time, and on the face of a man who had spent his life revealing nothing, something was slowly beginning to crack. "Do you know what made me believe you?" he said. "Not what you just said. Anyone can speak words. I've spent my whole life among people performing goodness for me. They swear loyalty. They tell me how honorable they are, how trustworthy they are, and they do it because they know I'm watching, because they want something from me. I learned not to listen to what people say about themselves, because it's always a performance." He pushed himself a little straighter, though it made him wince. "What I believe is what I just saw. You didn't know I was watching. You thought I was hidden behind those planks, unable to see anything, unable to hear anything. You could have chosen anything in that darkness, and I would never have known the truth. And still, you chose to cover for me, staged an entire dangerous act, put yourself in the mouth of his gun. While believing no one was witnessing it, he stopped. That wasn't a performance. People are most themselves when they think no one is looking. And what I saw of you, when you thought no one was looking, is something I haven't met in so many years that I had almost forgotten it was real." Maeve held his gaze, and between them there was a silence that was no longer caution, but something else, an acknowledgement. "I didn't do it so you would trust me," she said. "I know," he replied. "That's exactly why I do." A short laugh escaped her, not happy, only tired. "Then what are we now?" she asked, half to him and half to herself. "You're the man I should hand it over. I'm the woman who should have taken the money and run. And yet, I'm sitting here, stitching a life back together for someone I don't even dare call a friend, while you're placing your life in the hands of a strange clam digger." Elias looked at her, and for the first time since she had found him on the rocks, Something very close to a smile passed across the corner of his mouth. Thin and weary, but real. "We're two people who have seen each other," he said. "The true selves of each other, not the faces we show the world. You have no idea how rare that is, Maeve. People can live their whole lives beside one another, and never once see each other the way you and I have seen each other in 2 days." Maeve did not answer, because she could not trust herself, because in her coat pocket, the cold coin was still lying there. The bird over the anchor, and the strange warmth that had just begun between them, struck against it painfully, like flesh striking stone. He had just said he had seen her true self, but she still had not seen all of his, still did not know whether the hands she had just saved were tied to the night Daniel went out to sea and never came home. And she understood that this fragile trust, no matter how real it was standing on a knot she still did not dare pull, because she was afraid of what she would see when it came undone. Maeve could not sleep that night, and by the time the first gray light seeped through the gaps in the boards, she understood that she could not carry the coin in her pocket for another hour without asking. She took it out, walked to where Elias had just awakened, and set it down on the tarp in front of him. The seabird with its wings spread over the anchor staring up at them both. "This is yours," she said, her voice trained all night to stay flat. "I found it sewn into the lining of your jacket. I want you to tell me what it is." Elias looked at the coin, and Maeve saw something very rare pass across his face, not wariness but a heavy recognition, the kind of recognition belonging to a man who had just understood he was about to pay a debt he had avoided for too long. "It's a mark," he said slowly, "of the organization I run. The person who carries it is someone on the inside, someone trusted. It isn't something that gets dropped by chance. It's given." Maeve drew in a breath, and she drove the knife deeper, because she had gone too far to stop. "My husband once held one exactly like this," she said. "A few weeks before he died. I saw it in Daniel's hand, Elias, this very mark. He hid it when I came close, and then he went out to sea on a windless night and never came back, and they called it an accident." Her voice broke on the last word, not because she was crying, but because the anger rising inside her had nowhere left to go. "You said it's given to someone on the inside. Then tell me, what did my Daniel have to do with your world?" In a silence so long she could hear her own heartbeat, Elias looked at her, and then he did the one thing she had not expected. He did not evade, he did not excuse himself. He told the truth in the even voice of a man who had decided she deserved to hear it whole, even if it killed whatever had just begun between them. "I didn't know the name Daniel until you told me the story about the boatyard," he said. "But I know how things work, and I can piece together the rest. The man who hired you and your husband to build that batch of boats, and then disappeared without paying, the man who pushed you both into debt, was a link in my organization, a branch in this region. When Daniel lost the yard, when he lost the ability to repay the debt, that man came to your husband, not to collect, but to invite. A skilled boat builder, a man with boats, a man who knew every current in the area, was priceless to people who needed to bring cargo ashore without anyone seeing." Maeve stood frozen, and Elias went on, giving her no chance to lie to herself and pretend she had misheard. "They forced Daniel to move cargo for them to pay off the debt. Your husband made a few runs. Then he wanted to stop. Worse than that, he said he would go to the right person and tell everything, even if it dragged him down with it. A man trying to step out of that world while carrying what he knows is the greatest danger that world can face." He paused for a beat, and he looked directly into her eyes when he spoke the final sentence. "The man who ran this branch, the man who forced him and then handled him when he tried to walk away, staging an accident on quiet water, was Cormac Healy." The name fell into the shed like a stone dropped onto still water, and Maeve's whole world rippled outward in circles she could not pull back. Anger, pain, the feeling of being betrayed by the dead himself, all of it rose at once with nowhere to go. Her Daniel, the man she had mourned as an innocent victim of the sea, had hidden an entire world from her, had stepped into darkness without telling her a word, had died because of something she had never been allowed to know. And the person who had just told her that truth, the man sitting on the tarp she had spread out, eating soup from the bowl she had poured, living because of her hands, was the very face of the world that had swallowed her husband. "You're part of it," she said, and her voice was so cold now that even she did not recognize it. "The world that killed Daniel. You stand at the top of it. I saved you, I hid you, lied for you, put myself in front of a gun for you, and all that time you were one of them. Elias did not deny it. He only looked at her and he said softly, "Yes." And Maeve turned her face away because she could not bear to look straight at that truth for one more second. They sat in silence for a long time, the heavy silence of two people who had just crossed something they could not cross back over. And Elias was the one who broke it, not with an apology, because he understood her well enough to know that an apology now would be an insult. He broke it with an action. "Give me the bag," he said. Maeve looked at him, wary again, and he understood that look. "Not for the money," he said. "There's something else inside." She hesitated, then dragged the waterproof bag from the corner of the shed where it had lain for several days and set it down in front of him. Elias opened it, brushed past the vacuum-sealed stacks of money that he touched as though they meant nothing, and took from a sewn inner compartment something wrapped in waterproof plastic, a small notebook and a hard drive no bigger than the palm of his hand. "This is the real reason I was shot," he said. "Not the money. Money is only money. It can always be earned again. This can't. For years, I kept a private record, every transaction, every name, every account, every shipment from every branch under me. I kept it because in my world, information is the only thing that keeps a man alive. Cormac knew I had it. He betrayed me and tried to kill me because he wanted it to disappear with me, because in these pages there is enough to bury him many times over." He placed the notebook and the hard drive on the tarp between them, right beside where the coins still lay. "Daniel's final shipment is in here," he said. "There's the date. There's Cormac's order. There's even his command to deal with a boat builder in Stonehaven who is trying to get out. Your husband's name is in these pages, Maeve, not as a victim of the sea, but as a man who dared to do what very few people in that world ever dare to do. He chose to walk away." He pushed the two objects toward her. "I can't give your husband back to you," he said. And for the first time his voice carried something very close to urgency. "I can't turn back that night. I can't wash away the part the world I stood at the top of played in you losing him. Those things are beyond anyone's power. The only thing I can give you is the truth, complete with proof, strong enough to stand before anyone who dares look at it. The rest belongs to you." Maeve looked down at the notebook and the hard drive, and she understood at once what Elias had just done. He had just placed in her hands the strongest weapon he possessed, the only thing that still made him worth keeping alive, the thing that, if it fell into the wrong hands, would bring down not only Cormac, but Elias himself. He had stripped away the last layer of his armor and given it to the person with the most reasons to want him to pay. She could take it to Cormac in exchange for peace. She could destroy it to protect a man she had only just begun to trust. Or she could do the thing Daniel had wanted to do all his life and died before he could. "Aren't you afraid I'll use it to bury you too?" she asked. "I am afraid," he answered simply, "but I've spent my whole life calculating what was safe to give and to whom, and I'm tired of that now. This time I'm not calculating. I'm only doing what's right and leaving you to decide your part." Maeve picked up the notebook, her hands no longer trembling, and inside her mind two roads appeared as clearly as two currents splitting apart. On one side was the anger, screaming for her, to make Cormac disappear with her own hands, demanding blood for blood, demanding a hot and immediate justice. On the other side was something slower, colder, far harder. She thought of Daniel, not the Daniel she had just learned had hidden an entire world from her, but the Daniel who had chosen to step out of the darkness, even knowing the price. He had not chosen revenge. He had chosen to tell the truth. And Maeve, standing in the shed, with the evidence of her husband's death in her hands, understood that if she wanted to be worthy of the final thing Daniel had done, then she too had to choose that harder road. The next morning, Maeve went to the church, the notebook and hard drive wrapped tightly and hidden beneath her coat, and she found Father Brennan in the small room at the back, where the early light filtered through stained glass and spilled red and blue streaks across the wooden floor. She set everything on the table before him, the coin, the notebook, and she told him, not everything, not Elias, but enough. She told him she had found evidence that Daniel had been forced into Cormac Healy's shipments, that he had meant to walk away and expose the truth, that the night he went out to sea had not been an accident. Father Brennan sat listening, his old hands folded together, and when she finished, he stayed silent for a long time, his eyes on the notebook as though he were looking at something both heavy and sacred. "You know that once you bring this forward, you can never take it back," he said. "Cormac is not a forgiving man, And this road will be long. There will be lawyers, interrogations, nights when you wish you had never begun. You will have to stand in the light while every instinct in you tells you to lower your head and live quietly. Do you understand that cost? Maeve nodded. I thought about another road, she said honestly. I held this in my hands and thought about making him pay myself, quickly, neatly, the way he did with Daniel. I'd be lying if I said I didn't want that. But Daniel didn't die so I could become the thing that killed him. He died because he chose to tell the truth. If I answer that with blood, then I betray the very last thing he did. I don't want revenge, Father. I want justice. From far away, those two things look alike, but I've stood close enough to see how different they truly are. Father Brennan looked at her with an expression she could only call pride, the gaze of a man who had baptized her, married her, prayed Daniel into the ground, and was now seeing the girl he had known since childhood stand firm on something very difficult to stand upon. Then you need the right person, he said. And he rose and went to the old telephone hanging on the wall, making the call he had mentioned a few days earlier, to the old acquaintance now working as an investigator outside the county. The honest man who had once said that Daniel's death smelled wrong and had wished someone would give him a thread to pull. That man came to Stonehaven 2 days later, without ceremony, without a black car, only an old vehicle and a worn leather briefcase. And he sat in the back room of the church while Maeve laid out every page, matched every date, every name. He was the kind of man Maeve had rarely met in her life, the kind whose integrity was not an appearance, but a spine. And when he closed the notebook after many hours, he looked at her and said, "This is what I've been waiting for all these years without knowing I was waiting for it. You did the right thing bringing it to me instead of doing anything else. What followed did not happen in gunfire or a chase, but in the way real justice works when it works as it should, slowly, quietly, and unstoppably. There were meetings Maeve did not attend, papers signed in places she had never been, agencies far larger than Stonehaven, beginning to follow the thread she had given them. And then one morning, without trumpets or spectacle, they came to take Cormac Healy away, and this time he was not the one holding a gun as he crossed someone else's doorway, but the one led out beneath daylight to answer for the things he had believed he had buried beneath the bottom of a still stretch of water. Maeve was not there. She was at the fish dock, mending a net, when the news reached her, and she only stopped her hands for a moment, looked out at the sea, then bent over and went back to work. The cost of doing the right thing, she had come to understand, was not a moment of glory. It was accepting that justice never gives us back what we have lost. It only makes certain that what took from us does not take from anyone else again. And for Maeve, standing beneath the tin-colored sky with a length of net cord in her hands, that was enough. Elias was strong enough to leave on the night before they came to take Cormac away, and he chose to leave at exactly that moment, quietly, without letting his name attach itself to the thread Maeve was pulling, because he understood that the best gift he could give her was not becoming a new burden on the road she had just chosen. His people, the ones he had verified were still loyal after Cormac fell, had found him through a channel he had carefully reopened. Before leaving, he left the waterproof bag on the tarp, opened, the vacuum-sealed stacks of money laid bare beneath the oil lamp. "This is yours," he said. "Enough to clear every debt, buy back anything you ever lost, and live the rest of your life without ever having to count spare change again." Maeve looked at the bag for a long time, and then she shook her head. "I'm not taking it," she said. Elias frowned, not out of anger, but because he did not understand, because in all his life he had never met anyone who refused the thing that could solve every problem they had. "You're in debt. You're raising a child who isn't yours. You mend nets for hire to buy heating oil. This isn't pity, Maeve. This is what you've gone too long without." "Why?" Maeve folded her arms, and she answered in the flat, steady voice he had come to know. "Because if I take that money, then the past 3 days become a transaction," she said. "I saved you, you paid me, we're even, debt settled. But I didn't save you to be paid, and I won't let anyone turn what I did into a price. And there's one more thing." She stepped closer, her eyes never leaving his. "That money comes from the world that killed Daniel. Some of those dollars may even come from the very shipments he was forced to carry. If I take it to rebuild my life, then I'm building on my husband's death. I'm not selling Daniel's death, Elias. Not for any number." Elias stood still for a long time, and Maeve saw on his face the same expression she had first seen when she told him he needed her more than she needed him. the shifting of a man forced to reconsider something he had thought he understood. Then he nodded slowly, folded the bag closed, and said, "All right, I respect that," but he did not leave right away. He sat down, and in the voice of someone who had moved from a world of guns into a world of contracts, he told her about something else. "I have legitimate businesses," he said, "truly legitimate, with licenses, books, and accountants who sign their names. One of them is a maritime company. It buys wrecked vessels, abandoned hulls, raises them, restores the ones that can still be saved, and dismantles the ones that can't. It needs someone to run operations along this stretch of coast. Someone who understands the sea, understands boats, someone who can touch a hull and know where it can still be saved." He looked at her. "I'm not giving you money. I'm giving you a job, a yard with papers in your name, something you can stand on with your own 2 feet. Everything about it is clean, Maeve, I swear. Not one dark dollar will touch you. Not one thread will pull you into my world. This is the only part of my life I can give someone without staining them." Maeve fell silent, because she heard the difference at once, the difference between a sum of money that would make her beholden and a trade that would make her herself again. And she heard something even deeper in that offer, a symmetry almost cruel in its beauty. The sea had taken her Daniel, the sea had taken the boatyard, the old life, everything. And now someone was offering her the chance to turn that very sea into the place where she salvaged what others had lost, pulled from the bottom the things everyone thought had sunk forever, restored the boats everyone else had abandoned. The thing that had taken everything from her would become the thing she used to save. "I'll think about it," she said. But both of them could hear in her voice that she had already decided. This time, Maeve did everything in the right order. She had learned the price of doing it wrong, had paid that price with her boatyard and her husband, and she would not make the same mistake again. Before she picked up a single tool, she sat down with the paperwork, read every line of the contract until she understood every word, and hired a lawyer from the next town to confirm that the yard truly stood in her name. Clean, free of hidden ties, exactly as Elias had promised. She got the licenses before accepting the first job. She bought insurance before allowing anyone to step onto a vessel she had salvaged. The knot she had once let fail, trust misplaced in place of black ink on white paper. She mended firmly this time before stretching the whole net. Daniel would have laughed, she thought, if he could see her being this careful. She who had once told him that asking for a contract from a decent person was an insult. Now she understood that a contract was not suspicion. It was a way for people to respect one another enough that no one had to guess. The salvage yard began small, a wreck pulled from the shallows, an old hull people had thought abandoned, only for the grain of the wood to come alive again under Maeve's hands. She was good at this in the way Daniel had once been good, needing only to lay her hand on a boat to know where it could still be saved, and there was a quiet healing in pulling up from the bottom of the water, each day the things other people had given up on, restoring them, giving them a second life. The sea that had once taken everything from her had now become the place where she went to save things, and she did not know what to call that except something close to forgiveness. Once the yard was steady, Maeve did the thing she had wanted to do for a long time but had never dared, because before she had had nothing to give. She filed the papers to adopt Rosa officially. The girl had lived in between for too long, an orphaned child loved by the whole neighborhood but belonging to no one in particular, and Maeve had loved her from the first day, yet had always feared that love was not enough to raise a child. Now she had a warm home, a trade, a future she had built with her own hands, and she no longer had any reason to wait. On the day the paperwork was completed, she picked Rosa up from the church, knelt to the girl's height in the back room where colored light spilled through the glass, and told her that from now on she was Maeve's daughter, forever, with proper papers, and no one could take her away anymore. Rosa did not understand the full legal meaning of that, but she understood the arms holding her, understood the choked voice of the woman who had chosen her out of the whole world, and she wrapped her arms around Maeve's neck and called her Mom for the first time, and Maeve held the girl tightly while letting the tears she had held back for 18 months finally fall. Not tears of loss this time, but of something just found. That afternoon she sat with Father Brennan on the church steps, the two of them looking out toward the sea as it changed color in the evening light, and she told him about Rosa, about the yard, about the strange feeling of her life beginning to take shape again. "I used to think the tide only knew how to take," she said. "It took Daniel, took the yard, took everything I had." Father Brennan nodded slowly, his old eyes following a distant boat beyond the mouth of the bay. "The tide always brings something back to shore," he said. "It has never only known how to take. The question was never whether it would bring something back, but which wave would carry it in, and whether you would be awake enough to recognize it when it came. Many people stand right on the shore and let their gift drift past because they are too busy staring at the place where the waves carried something away." Maeve sat in silence, thinking of the morning she had gone out to the rocks in search of a clam bed that did not exist, thinking of the sound behind the granite outcrop that she could have ignored. She had been awake enough to turn toward it, and she understood, sitting there in the evening light with the old priest beside her and a daughter waiting for her at home, that she was not entirely healed. Perhaps she never would be entirely healed, but the wound inside her had become a scar now, no longer a bleeding tear, a knot mended, strong enough to hold everything that remained. A year passed like the tide, steady, unhurried, taking away and bringing back according to its own rhythm. Maeve's salvage yard now had its name on the dock, 2 men working alongside her, and a row of old boats being restored beneath the shelter, each one a story pulled up from the bottom of the water. Rosa had grown taller, had learned to tell different kinds of wood apart, and had grown used to sitting on the wooden steps of the yard each afternoon, waiting for her mother to finish work. And then, on a late autumn afternoon, when golden sunlight spilled across the bay, Elias returned. He came alone, no black car, no men with him, only a man in a simple coat standing at the edge of the dock, watching her work, and when Maeve looked up and saw him, she did not startle, as though some part of her had always known this tide would come back once more. He looked stronger, the scar along his jaw faded in the sun, and his eyes no longer held the cold measurement of that first day, or perhaps she had learned how to see through it. "I only stopped by," he said, "not for any business. I wanted to see whether you were all right." They stood together at the edge of the dock, looking out at the tide slowly rising and licking at the feet of the wooden pilings. And for a long time neither of them said anything, because between them silence had never been an emptiness that needed filling. At last Elias asked the thing he had perhaps carried with him for an entire year. "That day on the rocks," he said, "when you decided to save me instead of taking the money and walking away. Were you reading me? Did you see something in me that I couldn't see?" Maeve laughed softly, shook her head, her eyes still on the water. "I wasn't reading you," she said. "That day, I knew nothing about you at all. You could have been anyone. I was reading the tide. I was reading the fact that there was a human being trying not to die 10 steps away from me. You just happened to be what the tide brought in that morning. If it had been someone else lying behind that rock, I would have done exactly the same thing. It was never about you, Elias. It was about who I am when I stand before a choice." Elias nodded slowly, as though that was the answer he needed, even if it was not the answer he had hoped for. "There's one more thing I still don't understand," he said. "You refused the money, enough to change your life, and you pushed it back without blinking. But you accepted the yard. Both came from me. Why was one acceptable and the other not?" Maeve bent down, picked up a scrap of wood at her feet, turned it in her hand, and when she answered, her voice carried the weight of the whole year she had lived. "Because money would have made me indebted to you," she said. "Every day I spent it, I would remember where it came from, and I would live the rest of my life as something you had bought back. But the yard is different. The yard made me someone who could stand on her own 2 feet. I wake up every morning, and what keeps me alive is my own sweat, not anyone's kindness. You didn't give me wealth, Elias. You gave me back my tide, my trade, the sea, the ability to feed myself and raise my child. That's the only thing I could accept and still remain myself." Elias looked at her for a long time, and then he did the rarest thing she had ever seen from him. He smiled, a real smile, not mocking, not calculating. "Daniel was a lucky man," he said softly. No matter how it ended, then he turned away and walked along the dock in the evening light, and Maeve did not call after him, because she understood that some people pass through our lives only so we can recognize who we are, and then they must continue on their own road, and that is right. She returned to her work, where Rosa was waiting on the wooden step, and mother and daughter bent together over the side of an old boat still being restored, the tide rising full around the dock pilings, the water tapping gently against the wood. The girl held the plank while Maeve fastened the joint where two boards met, careful, firm, in the right order, and when she tightened the last fitting, she patted the side of the boat the way Daniel once had, and spoke to Rosa the words he had left her like someone leaving a lantern behind. A good joint can hold the whole net, my child. Do this one place right, and the whole boat will hold. The sun lowered over the mouth of the bay, the sea turning the color of slowly cooling embers, and Maeve sat there amid the smell of wood and salt, with the daughter she had chosen beside her, in the yard she had built for herself, on the dock she had returned to, and for the first time in a very long time, she did not feel she was waiting for anything, fearing anything, or regretting anything. She simply sat in an afternoon that belonged to her, let the day be peaceful and ordinary, and understood that what had truly washed ashore that morning had not been the money bag, not the wounded man, but the last chance for her to find herself again. And she had been awake enough to recognize it. Maeve's story reminds us that a person's dignity does not lie in what they own, but in what they refuse to trade away. That true kindness is not giving people money, but giving them back the ability to stand on their own 2 feet. That justice is higher than revenge because it heals instead of sewing more wounds, and that family is not always what we are born into. Sometimes it is what we choose with our whole heart. If this story touched your heart, please press the subscribe button on our channel, like and share, so you can listen to more meaningful and captivating stories every day. How do you feel about Maeve's story? Which moment stayed in your heart the longest? The moment she put the money bag back on the stone, the moment she chose justice instead of hatred, or Rosa's first call of mother? Please leave a comment and share the feelings from deep within your heart. We always read and treasure every line you write. May everyone watching this video always have truly good health, a joyful life, peace every day, and remain awake enough to recognize the beautiful things life is quietly bringing toward them. Goodbye, and see you again in the next stories.